I'm Adrian Warnock, and I'm here with my new friend Keith Plummer. Although I think we've both been aware of each other online for a while, isn't that right, Keith?
That's true. It goes back years when I was blogging, you were blogging, you're still blogging. I'm not, but we shared some links and crossovers years ago.
No, yeah, that's right. I don't know if you ever saw my books at all back then, Keith, or probably
I
not.
I I did see the book that you did on the resurrection.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
yes,
that
very
was
much
quite a while ago now.
appreciated that.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you. Yeah, I've updated that more recently, and now it's available in a sort of slightly expanded form. And one of the things I did to it most recently was added a sort of afterword to it, and it had a chapter by somebody that I'm sure almost every Christian today has heard of, Charles Spurgeon, on the resurrection.
Hmm.
But it also had a chapter by somebody else who I think you are perhaps one of the most passionate modern sort of followers of, perhaps, or certainly of the ones I've met, a man called John Newton.
Yeah.
And so I took one of his Messiah sermons, because he did this series of sermons, didn't he, on the entire collection of 50 verses that Handel put to music. And that's in the back of that book now as well. Updated into modern English to make it a little bit easier for my readers. But
Mhm.
yes, so we share a passion, don't we, of John
We do.
Newton. Before we get to that, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do now and how you got to be in that position?
Sure. I am the dean of the School of Bible and Theology at Cairn University, which is in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. I've been in this role since 2020. I've been teaching at Cairn since 2010. Prior to that, I was in pastoral ministry in the Midwest in Illinois, and I was there for 18 years. So I got into teaching at Cairn through a friend who knew of my desire to do academia in a Christian context. And she put me in touch with some folks here, and that is what led to my being here. I teach primarily in apologetics, and I also teach a course called Technology and Christian Discipleship. And that's a little bit about how I arrived here.
So you're interested in technology. I've, as you know, been sort of very interested in John Newton and updating his writings into English and releasing that in a book form, but also on my Substack and on my Pathos blog. And one of the things I came across, which I'm sure you've read, is a list of his kind of pithy sayings. And I remember thinking as I read those that if he was alive today, there's no question that he wouldn't be on Twitter and also probably on Substack because of all the letters he wrote, which he then, was quite happy to make public. He quite liked the idea, without revealing confidential details of actually publishing letters that he'd written, didn't he?
Yes. Yes. No, I don't I wonder what he would do with Twitter, because he had an appreciation for the as you said, the letter, and he could I think he liked long form stuff, though he did have those pithy sayings. I think a lot of them were drawn out of the context of things that he had, written.
Yeah, so maybe he'd be a bit more like, I don't know, say a John Piper who, would sort of write long form stuff and maybe, obviously sermons and such like, and then other people would find the kind of pithy quotes. Uh, but
Right.
his
I could see
writings are
him on
kind of peppered
Substack,
with that.
though.
Sorry?
I could see him on Substack.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But I think other people would be the ones, almost every other paragraph would be some pithy quote or other, because his writings are quite dense and insightful like that, aren't they?
Yes. See, I think what's happening today oftentimes is people who are preaching and doing public speaking are almost looking for the tweetable or postable bit, whereas with Newton, I think they just came from his expounding on things.
Yeah, no, I think you're right because you often see if you take one of these pithy quotes and put it into context. I did that today myself. I think it was Ben Virgo put one out today on Facebook. He's another chap that if you ever come over to the UK, you must meet Ben Virgo because he does these historical tours in London. So he takes people around all the main churches in London, including, of course, Newton's church. And you can see the
Okay.
pulpit that Newton preached from. And he also takes people around the British Museum and shows them all the sort of archaeological finds related to the Bible. And he's been a friend of mine for many years now. And
Is there a ministry that he is with?
Yes, that's right. His ministry is called Christian Heritage London.
Oh, yeah, we have had some interaction online. Yes.
Ah, very good,
Yes.
very good. But yeah, no, I think you'll have to come over to the UK, and we can also go to Olney together, perhaps.
I would love that.
Yeah,
I
I
would
really
love
want to
that.
go to Olney, but we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. So we've known a little bit about you, and we're wanting to talk about John Newton. Now, some people might think, why is Adrian talking again about John Newton? Well, I think you'd agree with me that he's possibly the most important figure for right now in the 21st century that we can look at historically. I mean, obviously outside of the Bible, I really feel that quite strongly, and for a lot of different reasons. Actually, I'd be interested if you would agree with that.
Well, superlatives and I don't have the best of relationships, but I don't know if I would say he's the most, but I would certainly say that he is a very, very important one for our times.
Okay, maybe you'd say one of the most. I don't know, but
Yeah.
it's funny, isn't it? Because Martin Lloyd Jones, when he was preaching, almost every time would say that this verse is the most important in the Bible, and then he'd proceed to preach on the verse that he'd obviously been studying, and perhaps I'm
Right.
feeling that partly because I have been, relatively recently discovering John Newton, other than yourself. But when I had my last conversation with a Brit who's also interested in John Newton, partly because of the link with Isaac Watts and hymns, because he's an expert in theology and worship, which I thought was quite a
Mm.
nice combination. He runs a school, a course in one of the UK schools, London School of Theology, actually, which
Mhm.
they do for worship and theology. That's what they do. So it's like for worship leaders and such like. But he and I talked about this, and we were one of the
Sorry
reasons why
about
I
my
think.
lights there.
No, that's okay. One of the reasons why I think Newton is so important, and there are others, and I'm sure we'll come on to them, but one of the reasons is that Newton, well, he shows us in his life the power of grace and the reach of grace, and the fact that grace can reach not just to the sort of people that we sometimes look at and go, oh, they'd make a good Christian. What we
Mhm.
mean is they're like us. Maybe they've got the same facial features as us, and we'll probably come on to some of that as well later on. And that goes both ways, by the way, because churches, whatever the type of church they are, they'll often target people that look like them, that sound like them, that have a similar sort of social status to the main people in the population of the church, if you like. And
Mhm.
if somebody walks into the church who is a bit rough and ready, which I think we'd all agree, even today, most sort of seamen are, and Newton was certainly no exception to that, and was quite, when he was converted, was certainly quite rough and ready, quite violent, quite aggressive, quite rebellious against God. Not the kind of person you want to be around. In fact, even his fellow shipmates kind of marooned him, didn't they?
Mhm.
When he was like, "No, I don't want you. I don't want you here." And in fact, I think it was on the way back to London that his shipmates said that when a storm came, they thought he was a bit like Jonah, and that he was the
Mhm.
one that brought the punishment on them. So we said in that interview, would somebody like Newton be actually even welcome in our churches today? And I wonder what you think about that kind of question.
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and just to go along with some of the things that you were saying, in one of his writings, Newton said that God saved him just to show that he could. Be
Oh, I like that.
because because he was, he I mean, he described himself as not only enjoying engaging in sinful behavior himself, but enticing others to join him in it. He received some kind of pleasure from it. And, I don't know, I would hope that churches would accept someone like him, obviously doing a significant, looking at the manifestation of his life definitely bore the fruits of one who was genuinely
Mm,
regenerated, converted, and, he loved Christ, and he knew the power of grace.
mm,
And so he was, a physician of the soul, And
Yes.
I think he was one who our churches would definitely benefit from
Yeah.
because of his complete sense of, one of the things that I love about Newton is one of his sayings. He said, I'm a riddle to myself, a heap of contradictions." He knew that was, his heart was fallen, and he knew that his only hope was Christ, not only for forgiveness, but for change.
Mm.
And so, I think he is a fitting pastor, but I think that, as your question kind of intimates, there are probably numerous churches who, knowing about his past,
Mm.
would be suspicious as
Mm.
to his fittingness for the role of pastor.
No, I think you're right. And of course, that was true in his day as well. It took a while before he was able to get his pastorate after he'd sort of decided he wanted one, and
Yes,
thought that was how the Lord was leading him. So there were some people like, "Whoa, who's this guy? What's he doing?" But so
just kind
that
of like the Apostle Paul.
Oh, yes. In fact, that's really interesting because I think when I was reflecting and writing, and maybe this is my sort of superlativeness coming out, I don't know. Sometimes I think I maybe I use them too much, and perhaps you use them too little. I don't know. But this idea that you know, is it possible almost to think and imagine? Because he sometimes felt like, and he might have even said this himself, but this idea that was there anyone between him and St. Paul that really was quite such a dramatic example of just how far someone can fall and come away. I mean, because Paul was a murderer and
Hmm.
rebelling against Christ, and dragging people into prison, and we forget all of that. And God
Yes.
completely turned him around, and no wonder that Paul called himself the worst of sinners, which also Newton did about himself.
Hmm.
And it's like, I mean, I'm sure there are other examples, but he's certainly one of the most well-known examples of a testimony of grace that's so dramatic.
Oh, yes. And when you know his life, and then you read or sing Amazing Grace,
Yeah.
it just adds so much more depth to it because he did not write those words um, in order to sound flowery and so forth. The more you know about the man, you realize that he lived a life in utter astonishment that God had extended his mercy and his kindness to him when he knew how undeserving he was. He said in one of his writings, he is able to save to the uttermost. His blood speaks louder than all my sins. My soul is very sick, but my physician is infallible.
Oh, that's so wonderful. There's another line, isn't it? Which I didn't realize was his until quite recently. But he says, "Our sins they are many, but his mercies are more," which someone
Oh,
has
yes.
put into a modern song.
I
That
love
line, but
that
it comes
song.
out of one of it. Yeah, but that phrase actually comes out of one of Newton's letters, and
Hmm.
there's a few more. And I think we were mentioning this very briefly beforehand. That when you take earlier in this interview we were saying about this, weren't we? That when you take these little quotes, like his sins are they are many, but his mercies are more. Often with Newton, if you then go back to the original, that is like expounded and expanded, and you think, actually, I don't want just that sentence. I want the whole paragraph. No, wait, I want the whole letter.
Right.
and and
Definitely.
and you have quite an interesting relationship with Newton because a lot of people dip in and out. Maybe they're vaguely aware that he wrote that hymn, and perhaps they've read a bit of a biography or such like, or maybe they've even dabbled in some of his letters. But talk to us a bit about your relationship with Newton, how you first heard about him, and what it was that you embarked on, and I believe finished.
Sure. When I was in pastoral ministry in Illinois, there was a drummer, a member of one of the worship teams there. And I did some pastoral counseling when I was there. And he said, I think that you would really enjoy reading some of the letters of John Newton. And he recommended this abridged version of some of his letters. It was a small paperback. And I read it and I thought, this is good. And, it didn't really hit me as it did years later. So Newton came in and out of my life. From there, several years passed. and I think it was, I might be getting the order wrong, but I came across a book called Extravagant Grace, which was written to discuss his view of sanctification, and that captivated me. And then I came across some of his work through Tim Keller and some of his writing, and then I wanted I wanted to really get into him. I remember years ago reading or hearing John Piper say, "You should try to find someone from the past who can serve as a mentor to you through their writings and just immerse yourself in them." And I became really interested in Newton for a variety of reasons. And so there is a 4-volume set of the complete works of John Newton that Banner of Truth has put out, and my children got it for me for, I don't recall if it was Father's Day or my birthday. I think it might have been Father's Day. And I just set out, I said, I'm going to read a little bit of this every day. And it took me 2 years. And over that 2-year period, I read through the complete works. I continue to go back to them. I haven't started from the beginning and gone through them all over again, but I do revisit them. And that was such a rich experience for me. And I have told people that I love John Newton because he helps me to better know my heart and the one who alone can remedy it. Those were two things that were just keeping, coming up as you read him.
Mm. So you mentioned that there were several reasons why you liked him, even
Yes,
before you really dug in. And would you like to just elaborate what some of those were a little?
sure. Well, you've mentioned that he was just so grace saturated.
Mm,
And his emphasis on the grace of God as our only hope and the only power for change was just so refreshing to me. I appreciated his honesty as a pastor, who he shared how it is that though he was preaching these great truths of the gospel, there were times where he felt, as he said, like a dog under the table eating the crumbs of the food that he was serving up to other people. And um, I liked the fact that he viewed pastoral work as being analogous in many respects to being a physician. One of his favorite terms for Jesus was a great physician.
mm,
And he said of himself that he gained most of his experience as a, a burgeoning surgeon would by walking the hospitals. He
mm.
spent time with people who were suffering, and he gained from that a pastoral wisdom and knowledge that I thought was just so commendable and helpful. And I appreciated his pastoral counsel largely through the ministry of letter writing.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's interesting what you're saying there because there's two things that stick out of what you're saying, which I've also seen very much in the Newton that I've read, and I haven't read all of it, unlike you. And that is his um, two things around his pastoral kind of theory, if you like, his pastoral theology, but also his pastoral practice, and that's this idea that our hearts are really sinful and really deceitful and really evil, and that actually one of the biggest tasks you need to have as a Christian is to become more and more aware of just how sinful your heart is, which is not a particularly modern message in and of itself.
Oh
Um,
no,
but you could see that as quite negative and condemnatory, and oh dear, let's get all introspective and focus in on ourselves and try and root sin out of ourselves. But he didn't do that. He was
no,
much aware that that needs to be God's job, to actually deal with it. And that the idea of knowing yourself was to see how beautiful and wonderful the grace of God is. So he was grace satisfied. And grace, as you put it, saturated. That's a beautiful way of putting it. But I think, and this is something that we don't always see in people that claim to be, preaching the doctrines of grace, he had this incredible compassion towards others and their
mm,
suffering. So he didn't come to others in a pastoral setting and say, "You're a terrible sinner. You need to repent and you need to understand how awful you are," in a sort of harsh way. He
Yes.
came and met them in their place of suffering and in their place of sorrow, and was incredibly compassionate towards the people he saw, both in terms of face to face and, as you say, in terms of his letters.
Yes. Because he recognized himself in others and the sins that they were dealing with, the struggles that they were going through. At one point, he uses this analogy of how foolish it would be if a blind man were to be miraculously restored his sight, and then he were to go and take a stick and beat other blind men for being blind.
But do you know,
And
isn't that what is it? Wouldn't that be a good description of much preaching today, if we're honest?
yeah, yes,
You know?
he, as you were saying, he wasn't. People think today, well, if you focus upon the sinfulness of the heart, you are just going to be disparaging people. But Newton had this illustration once where he said that the Christian life is like the the bass and the treble line of music. That simultaneously there is a bass line that consists of these low notes in terms of our awareness of our sin and our weakness and so forth. But there's a melody line that there is a simultaneous joy, even coexistent with the recognition of the sinfulness. And I think what we tend to do is we say, well, either we're going to concentrate on the bass line or the melody line at the expense of the other. And Newton realized, no, these two coexist, and the knowledge of self is so necessary in order for grace to be properly appreciated. Um, and that's one of the things that just really, really um, captivated me about him in a way similar to how Calvin says that self-knowledge and knowledge of God are, um, they are interrelated. You see that throughout Newton's writing and his approach to pastoral ministry. He says that unless you know the 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 gravity of the sickness, you cannot properly prize the physician.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, using the medical model, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I'm medically trained.
Yeah,
That
you're a
was my
psychiatrist.
profession. Yeah, that's right. But we were always taught that you have to get to the diagnosis first before you can provide the treatment. And I fear that sometimes today we want to sort of offer a treatment to people, and
Mhm.
spiritually, we want to emphasize the love of God, and that's all great and wonderful. We want to be kind to people. We want to be compassionate. We want to show them that they're not alone and sit with them and all of these things. And of course, Newton did that, no less so than with Cooper, and we'll come on to that, I'm sure. But there's also a sort of unwillingness to actually help with the diagnosis sometimes, and a fear of perhaps not offending people. That's the
Yes.
one thing. So you see, you I guess you could call it emphasizing love and neglecting truth. But then there are others who do emphasize truth and want to sort of proclaim the gospel to honor God, but don't
Yes.
seem to be concerned about even being persuasive or winsome or kind to people. They just want to get that message out and make sure everybody knows that they haven't compromised. And just this morning, I was working on passage in James, and it came to me afresh. Really, this thing where it says in James, that we're all subject to temptation, but it comes from ourselves. It says no one
Mhm.
should blame God, and I don't think we do that too often today. But we certainly blame the devil for temptation, and yet,
Oh, yes.
or we pretend that we're immune from it. And I think that's where it becomes very dangerous. And I even wonder whether that kind of superficial idea of, well, if you're a mature Christian, then you've got a heart that loves God, and therefore you don't have to really worry about sin, isn't part of the thing that leads to complacency, naivety, and the vulnerability to great falls that we've seen all too often, unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah, this is one of the things that he said. This is in a letter that he wrote to an associate. He says, "You have one hard lesson to learn. That is the evil of your own heart. You know something of it, but it is needful that you should know more. For the more we know of ourselves, the more we shall prize and love Jesus and his salvation."
Beautiful. Yeah. That's a really powerful piece of writing that he's written there, isn't it?
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and I think maybe this is a point to just talk a little bit more specifically about Cooper. And one of the things that fascinates me as a psychiatrist, um, and also someone who served in pastoral leadership, and someone who's gone through suffering, not mental illness, but physical illness, and such significant physical illness at times that it certainly has had effects on my heart and mind. And there's been nights I have wept into my pillow and all
Mm,
night and things like that, and a world that kind of just collapsed around me. So I've been in the low points, and even today sometimes I get frustrated that I can't really work. I can still talk, but I can't
mhm,
talk all day, and I can't work all day, and I can't write all day. Um, and there've been many months when I haven't really been able to focus enough to have this kind of conversation when I've been at my illest, my sickest. And so I have become, well, I always believed in this anyway, because as a psychiatrist we're taught biopsychosocial. So we're taught that when you think about a mental problem, my psychiatric problem, mental health problem, or indeed when you talk about a physical health problem, that you need to apply not just the sort of biological medical model, oh, yeah, let's find out what's wrong with the body and give a tablet and fix it, but
mhm,
also, the mind and what we think about. And so obviously counseling comes out of that, but also very much the sort of replacing of negative thoughts with more positive ones and all of that sort of thing. We also need to look at the sort of social side and our relationships with other people and the sense of purpose and structure and all of those things, because that can have a massive impact on our well-being. And obviously, as a young psychiatrist, in the secular sense, you weren't taught to then focus on the fourth element to this. I call it a four-legged stool now, and that's obviously the spiritual. And
mm,
one of the things that struck me in the way he handled Cooper, and you can perhaps speak to this a little bit more, is that he did approach it as not merely a spiritual problem. In fact, he was quite clear that he thought this was an illness, and he even
mhm.
went to doctors, tried to get him some help, and obviously used tried to use the power of his friendship and the friendship of others, and just trying to keep him safe by monitoring him, stopping him killing himself. So I would argue that he was quite ahead of his time in using, although he didn't use those words, a biopsychosocial spiritual model in his care of Cooper. Would you agree with that assessment, having read all those letters?
I think so. You see such a beautiful friendship, and such a care in his concern for William Cooper, taking time to write hymns with him, to try to get him to focus on the grace of God and to focus less upon himself. Um, and it was taxing for him to invest this care that he did. But I think you're right. He recognized that there were a variety of aspects that were involved, and it couldn't be reduced to just one thing. So I do think he was ahead of his time.
Yeah, and of course it was quite striking how things developed, because there was this period of time when Cooper had been in a psychiatric hospital, but then he got out of that psychiatric hospital. He came into Newton's orbit, and decided to move to Olney to be with a Newton. And for a while, he was doing quite well, and he was effectively functioning as an assistant pastor there. They were, as you say, writing hymns together, and writing some amazing hymns.
Oh yeah.
But two of them coincided. And perhaps, again, I'm about to use a superlative again, perhaps two of the best, or even maybe the best, two hymns that have helped people at difficult times. And obviously, Amazing Grace
Hmm.
being one of them. And Amazing Grace, as we spoke about when I chatted with the theologian from the UK. You know, Barack Obama sung that famously,
Hmm.
spontaneously after a sort of mass shooting event, and
Hmm.
at these kind of big national moments of grieving, it gets used. But it also, I know for me personally, it was one of those songs that helped me when I was at my lowest physical
Mm.
point. And that song was released by John Newton on the 1st of January one year. And all the historical evidence suggests that Cooper may have actually written, perhaps, you know, that should be right up there in amongst other hymns that have helped people. And that was God
Mm.
Moves in a Mysterious Way, his
Yeah.
wonders to perform. And most historians think he probably actually wrote that on the 1st of January as well. So he certainly went to church in the morning, listened to that hymn being released, and possibly came home, wrote that hymn, chatted with Newton that afternoon as they usually would. But then obviously something terrible happened that night. I don't know if you want to sort of take over the story a little bit. But what's striking to me is that unfortunately, those two hymns, which have helped so many other people, actually didn't help Cooper.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the details of that evening. I think I can guess what you're alluding to,
Yeah, that
but
was the
I'm
time when he had he tried to kill himself,
yes.
and there was a sort of, you know, bloodletting, shall we say,
Yeah.
scene, and Newton and his wife went there, and they had to stay with him. Somebody had to stay with him for a long time after that. And the sad thing is that after that moment, he never ever regained his full sanity and his faith. And so he was Cooper was convinced from that time on that he was reprobate. That, you know, that God, he believed the
Yeah.
gospel, but he believed that God had damned him. But what's really striking is that, unlike perhaps many ministers of the time who would have said, well, you know, sort this out on a spiritual level. And obviously, I'm sure Newton tried to do that with him, but Newton was
Hmm.
convinced that this was a sickness,
Yeah.
much as many people would have said today, you know, because there's a recognition today that religion can be a major part of, or that people's mental health can affect their religion and can
Hmm.
change what they think about God and what they feel about themselves. And there can be a sort of false guilt and all of these kinds of things. And Newton somehow knew that, and, you know, continued to be his friend, sat with him for years really, and then even when he came to London, he continued the friendship. And when Cooper died, in his funeral sermon, Newton said that he was convinced that this guy was a Christian, which,
Hmm.
considering, you know, a lot of the views more common of around those times, was quite striking, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad you raised that hymn. If anyone has not read those words or sung those words, I would strongly urge you to go online, look them up. That is one of here. I'll go superlative. This is that is one of my favorite hymns. It
God
is so
moves.
beautiful. I regret the fact that it is not sung or known more widely.
Yeah. Yeah.
The truths that it conveys are beautifully expressed, and this is another thing that kind of goes back that another thing that really captivated me about Newton is his conviction about the meticulous sovereignty of God and the goodness of God. And you think about some of those lines in Cooper's song, um, the clouds you so much dread will drip with mercy on your
Mm,
head. I mean, it it is a wonderful, wonderful piece of hymnody that I think the church is impoverished by having forgotten.
mm. No, I think you're right, and it's got a remarkable history actually as well, that a lot of people are not familiar with this. But there's a remarkable incident in the life of the young Charles Spurgeon. So this is before he was actually converted, when he was a young boy, and an old preacher sat him on his knee, and, well, I don't know whether you're charismatic or not, but I'm going to use the word prophesied, and
Mhm.
not everybody would want to use that word. I get it, because it all depends on how you define the word prophecy. But what he said was, "This young boy will preach to thousands."
Mm.
And he said to Spurgeon, He says, and when you and oh, that's right. And he was very specific actually. He said, and at some point you will be invited to preach at this particular chapel.
Hmm.
I can't remember which the chapel was. He said, but when you are invited to that chapel, you must sing this hymn. And the hymn that
Hmm.
he said you must sing was "God Moves in a Mysterious Way." And so it's remarkable when you think that here's this hymn writer and poet who, again, I don't know that William Cooper is as highly regarded as he ought to be, just in terms of his poetry these days, but he is one of the great poets, quite
Hmm.
apart from his Christian faith. But here's this hymn that was written by this amazing guy that then, unfortunately, it couldn't actually help. But as someone put it, the clouds never parted for Cooper after
Hmm.
that day. And he may well have written it actually on the eve of his most dreadful attack, or
Hmm.
if not on the eve, certainly in the few days beforehand, because it was written in that time period
Yeah.
very clearly, not long before, and certainly not after, because he couldn't have written it after, because he couldn't grasp its truth. But those words were very much formative in Spurgeon's life, and sure enough, obviously we know he did preach to thousands, and he did get invited to that particular chapel. And when he went to that particular chapel, he had them sing this hymn. And I'm pretty
Hmm.
sure God Moves in a Mysterious Way made it into Spurgeon's hymn book, but Amazing Grace didn't. Spurgeon was
Huh.
probably aware of Amazing Grace because certainly there's a lot of language from that hymn that he uses in his sermons. I've done searches of my Logos Bible software editions of them and found phrases. I can't remember which ones now off the top of my head, but certainly, but he never put it in his songbook. I often speculate whether maybe Amazing Grace just wasn't put to a very good tune at the beginning.
Yeah.
But it's remarkable that, this man of God, Newton, who unfortunately came under such a sort of awful mental health problem, was used to release the greatest preacher of the Victorian era, and I think that's a superlative we can both agree on, at least of the Victorian era, Charles Spurgeon. That if it wasn't for that hymn, perhaps well, let's put it this way: that hymn played a huge part in his understanding and in his.
Yes.
So this is remarkable, isn't it? So this story of two men who were trying to pastor a small church in the village of Olney, which I one day I want to go to, and perhaps if you come to the UK, we can go together. I've not been yet myself, but I really want to go. But
That would
there
be
they
great.
were in that little village, writing two hymns that would affect millions,
Yep.
and yet, sadly, one of them was not able to receive. And I guess that's a shocking and scary thing because we realize then that we're not just spiritual beings,
Right.
we are also psychological and physical beings, and these afflictions can come on us in a way that stops us from receiving even such wonderful truth.
Yes. Over my shoulder, uh, that is Amazing Grace.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Someone gave that to me knowing of my love for John Newton, and I it's a cherished possession. Um,
Sorry,
yeah,
when you say "Is Amazing Grace," you mean what is it? Is it?
it is, um, it's actually like if you were to see it's like a page from a hymn,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's Amazing Grace.
Oh,
So
lovely,
it's got the notes and the lines and the lyrics on it. Yeah.
beautiful. So this hymn obviously is what everyone is most sort of aware of of his ministry, and going back to what we talked about his background in the sort of seaman area, sailor. He actually said that when he was a new Christian, there were so many dangers almost
Mhm.
daily that it gave him something to pray about, which is interesting
Mhm.
because before he was a Christian, I guess he was just toughened to it, like a lot of people facing danger on a daily basis are. But he said it helped it grow in his faith, and no doubt helped to inspire some of those words through many dangers, snares, and toils. I have already come. It was
Mhm.
grace that saved me this far, took me safe this far, and grace will lead me home. So yeah, his words were inspired by his own life, as we've already
Right.
mentioned. Um, but they were written a number of years after he'd stopped being at sea. But there's also something else remarkable about this hymn because, and I think we have to address this, and I'm glad we're addressing this now and not at the beginning because I don't want people to think this is the only thing that's important about Newton. But one of the things that has drawn me to him is his whole relationship to the slave trade,
Mhm.
which I think is all of a sudden a very topical issue even amongst Christians today, and it's
Yes.
very important that we actually look at this properly, and none of this idea that, oh, American slavery wasn't as bad as all that, which I've heard some Christians trying to say, sort of almost slavery denial, a bit like Holocaust denial that some people do
Mhm.
in terms of the Second World War. But his initial response was, in actual fact, to his conversion was actually to go even further into the slave trade and become a captain. And that's something people don't like to admit, but it's part of this whole thing about grace taking time to change us, I suppose. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but just and setting the scene, the only other thing I'll say is that, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the most remarkable things about Amazing Grace is that it never really took off in the UK at first.
Mhm.
And it was actually American slaves who began to sing it. No doubt were taught it by their white masters as a way to sort of increase their oppression. So you could argue, it was initially seen as a sort of, because if you make them Christian, then maybe they'll see it's God's will for them to submit and
Mhm.
all of that. But yet that hymn was grasped by them. A verse was added by them.
Mhm.
The tune, I believe, was chosen by them, and it
Yes,
became
that's
a
not the
song
original
of the
tune.
civil. Yeah, it became a song of the civil rights movement, didn't it?
Mhm.
So can you talk a bit to that, please?
Sure. I've thought a lot about this because when you hear about John Newton and you get a brief introduction, former slave trader who was converted and so forth, I think what people tend to think is that his conversion led to an immediate repudiation of the slave trade and that he got out of it. But as you mentioned, he didn't. He got further into it, and it was only really illness that led him to cease from his occupation as a slave trader. But he did go on to become a quite vocal opponent to the slave trade, was very instrumental in the life of William Wilberforce and encouraging him with respect to his efforts to end the slave trade in the UK. And it's interesting that when you read his thoughts on the African slave trade, he does think back. And I want to just share some of the things that he says, because there he says, the reader may perhaps wonder, as I now do myself, that knowing the state of the vile traffic to be as I have described, and abounding with enormities which I have not mentioned, I did not at the time start with horror at my own employment as an agent in promoting it. Custom, example, and interest had blinded my eyes. I did it ignorantly, for I am sure had I thought of the slave trade then as I have thought of it since, no considerations would have induced me to continue in it. So he looks back and he recognizes that he was blinded to something that was in actuality a horror.
So how does that apply to our thinking today, do you think?
With respect to
Well,
Christian
I guess
growth
with
in
respect to, civil rights and Christian attitude to all of those issues.
well, I think that Newton realized that he was involved in something that was inexcusable, but he says, I was blinded to it by the fact that it was accepted, the fact that there was personal interest that blinded me to things that I should have seen. And so I have thought, as someone who's greatly appreciates Newton, I have thought there's a possibility. I mean, I could never prove this, but there is a possibility that maybe some of my ancestors were trafficked, traded by John Newton.
Hmm.
And I think that Newton is a voice that looking back on, I mean, he goes into some detail about the atrocities
Yeah.
of the slave trade, the manner in which slaves were treated, everything from rape to the beatings and so forth. And in this same work, he says something else. He says that though he felt the disagreeableness of the business strongly, he says this, um, he came to the conviction that I considered it as the line of life which God in his providence had allotted me, and as a cross which I ought to bear with patience and thankfulness, till he should be pleased to deliver me from it. Till then, I only thought myself bound to treat the slaves under my care with gentleness, and to consult their case and convenience as far as was consistent with the safety of the whole family of whites and blacks on board my ship. And I don't think what he was saying here was, I don't think that he was trying to rationalize it, because what he was saying is there was a dis-ease in me. And I think that there was the recognition that something was wrong here. There was a dissonance that had been created within him, but it did take time for him to fully say, this ought not to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess one of the questions that we might ask ourselves is, what are we blind to today? That's an interesting question.
Yes.
You know, because it's very easy for us to almost be historically anachronistic and go, well, hang on a minute, you know, why didn't he understand that immediately? But let's just be really brutal for a minute here and honest. Jonathan Edwards didn't understand it. He owned
Mhm.
slaves, and he was a, you know, an amazing revivalist. You were seeing thousands of people saved, and yet he owned slaves. George Whitfield didn't understand this. You know, he owned slaves too, and he actually promoted making slavery more prominent, not less.
Mhm.
And he died. I think both of them died still unrepentant, if you like, of those views. But in that time, nobody really was speaking out about it. I mean, I'm sure that some of the enslaved peoples were trying, but their voices were not being heard. And it
Mhm.
was only later on, um, in the time of Wilberforce, and the link between Newton and Wilberforce can't be overestimated, really. It was him that very much encouraged Wilberforce to not just get started on tackling this evil trade, but also, you know, as you say, wrote that work, which was initially given to Parliament actually to try and help get rid of it.
Yes.
And that work, by the way, will be included in the Amazing Grace: How Faith Grows in the Human Heart, sort of anthology, really, of many of Newton's writings that I'm updating into modern English. I haven't got there yet, but it will be
Excellent.
there. And I think a new audience needs to hear it. But it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that society is often blind. Christians are often blind to things that we're doing that are clearly wrong. You know, because it's
Yes.
what's normal, and yet sometimes even within that context, it's important to be sensitive to the spirit and actually, you know, he clearly didn't just treat these slaves almost as animals, which I think is the way a lot of people justified it. If not animals,
Mhm.
at least as not as important as white people, not as human somehow as white people. I think was a very common view of the time. It's like we treat them almost as property, you know,
Yes.
and that was the view. And of course, he had some sense initially, just a fleeting sense, a sort of glimmer of light, a bit like when Jesus sort of partially healed that blind man. And the man said, "Oh, I see men, but they're walking around like trees." And I think what you're describing there is the beginnings of an understanding that these people were brothers. And I mean, very famously, when the slave abolitionist movement was there was that whole thing with a symbol of a black man enslaved, and the saying underneath, "Am I not also a brother?" And
Yes.
that had to be asked because it wasn't uniformly believed that they were. I think by many white people, and it was Wesley that in his earlier life was actually very much pro slavery, just as all these other people were. But by the end of his life, I think the very last letter he wrote was to Wilberforce to encourage him in his work to abolish the slave trade. So there is hope that blindness can be dealt with.
Yes.
But I think it worries me a little bit that we're seeing a little bit of a backsliding on some of this. You know that,
Hmm.
and I don't want to get too much into the politics of it. I get it, but I think as a Christian and within the Christian movement, we have to be quite concerned that the sort of reaction against DEI, I think they call it, don't they? Diversity, inclusion, and exclusion, or whatever it's called. Diversity. Oh, I
Diversity,
can't.
equity, and inclusion.
That's the one. Yeah. So there's a
Right.
sort of backlash against that that obviously has been coming from the politics and the MAGA movement and the Trump movement. And it worries me that as a result of that, there are now some white Christians saying things like, "Well, slavery wasn't that bad," um, and saying things like, "We don't really have to worry about black people because there is no racism anymore," or things like that. And I just wonder if perhaps you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Um, Now, I would say that I think that some of the uh, some of the concern about DEI, I would share
Hmm.
because of some of the underpinnings that are there, and that's a discussion for maybe another time. But I think we are prone to going to one of two extremes, where either race is seen as everything or race is seen as nothing.
Hmm.
And the pendulum does swing, but I think that both ends of that swing they have errors. So to make everything a matter of race, I think is flawed.
Mhm.
To say that, as you were saying, well, race is no longer an issue that we need to concern ourselves with in terms of injustices and so forth, I think that is also wrong. Um, it's not that I'm saying that we have to find a happy medium that is directly in the center, but I am saying I think the truth is not on either of those extremes.
Mhm.
That said, um, you know, at the beginning of his thoughts on the African slave trade, Newton said this. He quotes Matthew 7:12. It's in the beginning, all things whatsoever ye would that men would should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And he says in that work, the slave trade was always unjustifiable, but inattention and interest prevented for a time the evil from being perceived. And Newton did not, it was not popular for him to preach as he did against the slave trade. He he suffered some scorn
Mm.
for his taking the stance that he did. And so as we're thinking about our contemporary situation, I think that if we are going to be upholders of biblical truth, we have to, what Newton does for us is that he challenges us to be willing to suffer scorn even from other Christians for the sake of defending the truth. And so with respect to there are some things that I have biblical convictions about with respect to a more progressive view of DEI that I have to have the boldness to say I think that that is an error.
Mm.
Likewise, there are things that are on the more conservative end of the spectrum that would seek to um, offer an alternative history to erase certain unpleasantries about American history and so forth that I think, as a Christian, a concern for truth requires me to be willing to experience, what would you say, scorn from that side as well.
Mm. Yes, I think you're right, and there is a sort of, as you say, I like the way you put it about trying to rewrite history. I mean, as a Brit watching on, I've always thought it was interesting the sort of different attitudes that the various countries have to their history. So, in my case, as a Brit, certainly, and I'm not sure if this might be changing a little bit now, but in my case, as a Brit, growing up in school, going through school, history was, we talked about William the Conqueror, we talked about the Romans, we talked about all of that. And then there was this kind of big jump, and we sort of airbrushed out the whole history of the British Empire, and the whole
Mm,
history of slavery, and the whole history of all of that stuff. It was just not mentioned. And I think we then obviously started talking about World War One and World War Two when we could perhaps, have a sense of pride about what we'd done. And reflecting on that in recent years has really made me think that perhaps it's something of our national sort of culture that we want to just forget the embarrassing past. And I'm not sure that's particularly helpful.
no.
I think what's also unhelpful is overly celebrating it, and you see that a little bit. I mean, some of our statues. There's been a lot of controversy about should we be celebrating people, who were these flawed individuals historically. Um, but I mean, if you take the French celebrate Napoleon in a
Mm,
huge way. And it's almost like they're quite proud of what he did, even today. Many of them, I'm not sure all of them would be like that, but certainly that's the impression you get. But
mhm,
they talk about it and they're kind of almost proud of it. The Germans, on the other hand, they have made absolutely clear that as a nation, they're going to remember what happened in particularly World War Two. And so they teach the history and they have Holocaust museums, and they're absolutely clear that everyone needs to understand what happened. Although
mhm,
even there is this rather worrying rise of the right wing at the moment, who would also try and minimise the Holocaust in the same way. And it's often the same people who minimise the Holocaust who also try and minimise racism and minimise even slavery. And it
mhm.
is quite worrying. And looking at America, I'm not sure, and you might have some thoughts on this, as to historically where America sat with this. And maybe it's partly because it's all still quite fresh, because the civil rights era and sort of removing of segregation and all of that was really within my lifetime. So maybe it's too fresh for you to have, as a nation, come to the point of, are we going to just ignore our past, or are we going to celebrate it, or are we going to sort of mourn over it, if you like, and actually, make it not just a one-off day where we celebrate Martin Luther King, but as a sort of, issue where we do recognise what all this has happened. And it really worries me a little bit. This phrase "Make America Great Again," because I look at that and I go, well, was it ever great before? Was it ever great for your ancestors, particularly?
Well, yeah, I think that the question of what period of time you have in mind when you use a term like that is always worth asking.
Yeah.
And I do think that there are periods of time where there were coexisting greatnesses and atrocities. And
Yes.
again, I think that, and I hate these lights, which are motion sensitive. And so if I'm too still, they go off.
You need to be
Sorry
more
about that.
charismatic, Keith. Clearly, wave
And
your arms around.
but like I was saying about Newton speaking of the Christian life and the coexistence of the bass and the treble clef,
Mm,
I think those things are true of countries as well, in the sense, not redemptively necessarily. That's not what I mean. But I think, what happens is it's like we can't walk and chew gum at the same time.
mm,
It's either we've got to, in the name of patriotism, only remember the glories and to recognize that there were atrocities and injustices that occurred, that somehow that is to be less than loving of one's country. That's just unrealistic. You look at some of the writings of someone like Frederick Douglass, for example. Frederick Douglass, in his moves towards abolition and the things that he was drawing people's attention to, is he's saying we are not being true to the principles that these are great principles,
mm.
but we need to live consistently with them. And so, recognizing, acknowledging wrong does not need to be at cross purposes with patriotism, love for one's country, and the desire to see it truly great. If
Mm.
anything, um, that is a necessity.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess maybe this is one of the things that's so good about Newton is that many people today, I think, they're either a social justice warrior
Mhm,
or they're a proclaimer of the gospel truth. Newton was both.
mhm,
They're either compassionate and kind and willing to sort of be generous, if you like, and patient with people who are suffering, or um, or they want to preach the gospel and help them to see how sinful they are and help them to convert. Not many people have both those things,
mhm,
and I think maybe that's one of the lessons that we have. And Newton certainly was criticised. He was criticised by Calvinists for being too
mhm,
soft, but he was criticised by Arminians for being too rigid on the sovereignty of God. And he said, actually, maybe that means I'm somewhere right if they're both criticising me. There's a
mhm.
great line in one of his letters about that. Um, but I think perhaps this is why he's got so much to tell us today, because I do worry that we're losing the real skill of pastoral care face to face, where people are compassionately met in their suffering and appropriately challenged when that's needed, but not one or the other without the other.
Yes, and, thinking about his relevance for the contemporary scene, as you were just discussing, it brought something else to mind that I wanna get out there for people to look up. His, the letter that he wrote concerning, and I do forget how it's titled, but it has something to do with godly disputation.
Ah, yes.
Um, he wrote a letter to someone who asked him, as he was thinking about addressing a doctrinal error of another brother publicly in writing. Newton wrote him a letter that it's available online. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
Lessons in Godly Disputation or something like that,
I
but if
think
you
it's
look up
something like that. Yeah,
Newt
I've read this one, but this is good. Yeah.
if you look up Newton and godly disputation, the counsel that he gave to that fellow minister is priceless. And whenever I read it, I think this should be required reading for anyone who is going to be engaged in any kind of online discussion and debate with other Christians,
Yeah.
because it is so wise and pastoral and biblically saturated in terms of how do we have disagreements in a godly manner. It
Mm.
is wonderful.
Yes, I've definitely read this and updated it into modern English. I may have even posted it online. I can't remember which bits I have and haven't. If I haven't, I will make sure I do that, because I think
Hmm.
it's a very important letter, as you say. And if I have, then if you're reading this, sorry, if you're watching this, then make sure you follow the link below and go to Substack, where I'll put the link to that particular piece, either in updated English if I
Great.
can get it, or in the original. And I think that these days, of course, your people watching have the opportunity, if they don't want to read the original, to read it in updated English as I'm updating it. But they also have the option to get the paper volumes like you did, if that's what they want, of the originals. Or you can get all of John Newton's works, or almost all of them, in Logos Bible software form. And I don't know if you're a Logos Bible software user, but I love Logos, and
Hmm.
it's just wonderful sometimes to sort of search and realize just how much he had to say that is so relevant today. And I guess
Oh yeah.
there's nothing new under the sun, the Bible would say. And the situation that Newton and his people might have faced was very different. But the realities of the gospel were very true, and there's an urgency about him. And one of the things I
Hmm.
was recently reflecting on was some of his language about worrying about loss and the fact that he backslid early in his faith. And one of the things he said there was that what arrested him the first time was the storm, and that's a famous story of his. And what arrested the second time was a fever that made him think he was going to die. And I just thought to myself, is that part of our problem? It's almost like we're
Mm.
too safe. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think you're right. Newton had this sense of, I wish I could remember where he says this, but he says, like, we are just as much in need of the Lord's help when everything is okay as we are when we are on a ship that
It's
is.
that's it's in his autobiography, which I'm
Mhm,
not sure if that was part of the letters that you wrote. They A lot of the Newton works change that and make it more into a biography with excerpts. But when it was first
mhm.
published, it was his words, and that bit I'm almost finished going through what was called the authentic narrative.
Narrative,
And it
yes.
was released actually around the time he wanted to become a pastor as his testimony of the grace of God at work into him until that point. And at the moment, I'm working through the last bits of that. But
Mhm,
he definitely says in there that, because he basically comes off that boat and having been saved, and they get back to
mhm,
Ireland. And I think the next day or a few days later, he's out going shooting just for a bit of fun, and the gun goes off and
mhm.
blows a hole in his hat just below, just close to his head, and and that's the context in which he says
Mhm.
exactly what you're just going to say. So carry on. Sorry, we need God
Right.
in the safety.
Yes, we are always in need of God's, um, providential
Yeah,
care. It's not just in the dangerous times that we're aware of, but it is in every moment, and he is just such a great guide for recognizing the dependence that we really have, that we need to be aware of in every moment.
mm,
And I'm grateful for him. As I read him, he reminds me that I need Christ.
yeah. No, we all do, you know,
Hmm.
and I think that's the thing. There's a complacency about some modern Christianity and some modern Christian teaching that almost becomes an anointed form of self-help teaching, and it's
Yes.
like, and yet, it's there isn't that recognition. Actually, I can't follow my own heart. I can't trust my own heart because my own heart
Hmm.
is deceitful, beyond cure. And that's one of the sermons of his that has most impacted me, where he preaches a whole sermon on Jeremiah 17:9, and he
Mm.
applies that to the Christian, which I know not everybody today would, but I definitely am in agreement with him, as indeed was Spurgeon, and they've both written. And those two sermons are really helping to form my other book. I mean, I'm crazy. I'm writing two books at once, Keith, which is
Mm.
kind of silly, and that's called The Traitor Within. And it is exploring this whole idea that actually we have to understand that a huge part of our problem is self deception. Whether that's the way our body talks to us, whether that's the way our mind talks to us, whether that's the lies that increasingly our society is founded on,
Hmm.
or whether that, or is rather being destroyed by, let's put it that way, or whether that's the spiritual lies and getting the truth about God and such like. So I'm and I've done a bit of a silly thing actually, Keith, because I've released both of those books before they're finished, so they're in a sort of early access form on Kindle. I won't do it again. I had
Uh-huh.
this crazy idea that it would just be a matter of weeks, and so I set a timeline that was entirely unrealistic.
Mm.
And so I did release it. I mean, it is, obviously as I update them, people can get hold of the later versions, but I'm not going to do that again if I release any books. And I don't know what you think about this, but I think it's probably a good idea. I'm doing this big anthology, if you like, but as I finish the individual bits, to republish a sort of a modern English version of An Authentic Narrative. So if somebody's just looking for that, they can get that.
That would be very good,
Yeah, and so I
because
shall do that.
some of the language is, have to kind of muddle your way through. So something that is more contemporary that people could go
Yeah.
through more smoothly would be of great help.
Yeah, I hope so, and that's the plan. And certainly, the bits that I've released online already as well that people can just read. I think some people have started to find those quite helpful as well. There's three letters that are kind of core to his theology, of Christian sanctification, if you like, and Christian growth. It talks about the core, the corn, isn't it? The
Yes.
I don't know if you want to talk to that a little bit.
Well, it's funny you should raise that because today, just this morning at the Gospel Coalition site, I saw an article, John Newton on the ABCs of
Oh
Sanctification.
yes, 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 yes.
And it's referring to that letter where he's talking about stages of Christian growth.
Yeah,
And he's using the analogy of the the stalk, the ear.
and the
Um,
bull head of corn, I think it is. Yeah.
yes, and he's just talking about these 3 stages. That is a wonderful work where he is dealing with how it is that the Lord deals with the believer from infancy, so to speak, a new Christian, to whom he says the Lord gives cordials.
Mm.
There is this encouragement by way of answered prayer and joy and overcoming of sin. And then, but the believer at that stage doesn't really know his or her own heart like they need to. And then the next stage is a more of a awareness of the indwelling of sin. And then there is the mature stage, the main mark of which is humility
Mm.
and a submission to God's will, a humility towards others because of the awareness of um, the magnitude of grace that one has received and is in need of constantly. That is a wonderful, wonderful work to go through.
Yeah, well, those 3 letters I have already updated, and they are definitely available on my Patheos blog. So again, I will put those links on the Substack page. So if you're watching this on Substack, or indeed on YouTube, or if you're listening on a podcast, it's available on any of the podcast apps. You should see the show notes, and in the show notes there will be a link to the Substack page, and on the Substack page, as well as the full edited transcript of this. It'll take me a while because we've been talking for a while. I probably ought to draw this to a close soon, Keith. I've taken a lot of your time. But there will be that, and there will be the links of the things that we talk about. So I think that will be helpful for people. And and hopefully some people will decide to really dig into this and perhaps buy it in Logos. Other people may decide to even get a book and do as you did and just read a little bit of Newton every day. And Or they can get a hold of, obviously, already. I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of it that's already complete. So although it's not everything I want it to be yet, the book Amazing Grace, How Faith Grows in the Human Heart, which is available on Amazon Kindle, is something that you could use if you want to dig into it in modern English, because not all of that is available on my blog. There's just too much of it to keep putting
Yeah.
on the blog. Yeah. So there we go. It's been so good to talk to you, Keith, and perhaps we can do this again sometime.
Yes, that would be good. And if I ever do make it to the UK, I would
Oh,
love to get together and go to Olney
well,
together.
what's stopping you? What's stopping you, brother?
Oh, that costs money, Adrian. That
Ah, yeah, 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 yeah. Well, just get the flight over here, and we'll put you up and things like that. I'm sure.
oh, well, thanks. That would be a pleasure.
All right. Well, bless you, brother, and thank you
Bless you
very
as well.
much. And I think this has been a really, really interesting conversation. And it's funny, isn't it? Because you're obviously very much into the modern technology, but you're also very much into the old writings, and in particular those of John Newton. So I think this is a thing. We don't have to be old fashioned and sort of stuck in the past, but we do need to learn the lessons from the past, I think, as well.
Most definitely.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Keith. And you're on Substack, aren't you? So I hope people will follow you and
I am.
read your bits.
I'm not very prolific. I just use it for notes most often and pointing
Yeah.
to other things. But yes, I
Yeah. Well,
am.
that's very helpful. And perhaps perhaps this might encourage you to write a little bit more, a few articles on there and things, and perhaps to share some of your insights from the Newton reading that you've done. That would be much appreciated, I'm sure, by people. But thanks for everything you've said, and I look forward to us continuing a friendship and. And I say, let's meet in England.
All right.
All right, bless you. Bye
Bye-bye.
bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.